What do we find at the intersection of faith and the world? Our new podcast, Crossroads, explores this question in thought-provoking conversations featuring guests from around the world who are seeking to live faithfully in the public square. This is a safe space to discuss politics, technology, and our responsibilities as citizens. Pull up a chair and meet us as we search for a better way forward. Welcome to Crossroads, where we discuss the intersection of sacred and civic. I'm your host, Jo Nygaard Owens, and today we are joined by Rebecca Boggs Roberts, award-winning educator, author, and speaker, and a leading historian of American women's suffrage and civic participation. She's currently the Deputy Director of Events at the Library of Congress. Hi, Rebecca. It is an honor to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Also joining us today is the Cathedral's Chief Public Affairs Officer, Kevin Eckstrom. Welcome, Kevin. It's great to have you with us.
I'm happy to be here.
So, Rebecca, tell us a bit about your work and what led you to write Untold Power, the fascinating rise and complex legacy of First Lady Edith Wilson.
Well, I have always been interested in stories of American women's history, especially ones that the women themselves don't always want told. And I had written a couple of books on the suffrage movement, which the women very much wanted to be told and told in a certain way, but somehow until the kind of white-hot spotlight that the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment showed on it had been a little bit lost. And I was giving a lot of talks and teaching some workshops, and it seemed that almost anywhere I went, no matter who I was talking to, somebody would ask me about Edith Wilson. They'd ask me if President Wilson had finally changed his mind on the 19th Amendment, which he'd been dragging his feet on, because she whispered in his ear. And that's totally wrong. She was anti-suffrage. I have no idea how that narrative got out there in the world. But I was getting the questions predictably enough that I started reading up on her to make sure I was answering them accurately. And she's fascinating. I mean, she's just an extraordinary story, lived through extraordinary times. And the most recent biography about her made me really mad. So it's kind of in a rage. I put together a proposal for my publisher, and happily it was accepted. So it was kind of a whirlwind from idea to publication.
Fantastic. And for those of you listening out in the audience, if you haven't read Rebecca's book, Untold Power, The Fascinating Rise and Complex Legacy of First Lady Edith Wilson, do yourself a favor, go to our show notes where we're going to link not only to the book, but also to an article that is the prologue of the book that's in the Smithsonian Magazine, and it'll get you hooked. It tells this really intense synopsis, and it's worth every minute of reading that.
Well, and I think she's also an interesting story because, well, Rebecca, you tell us, but a lot of people might consider her America's first female president, even though she wasn't, but she has this really unique role in American history because of her husband's stroke.
No question. And I kind of hate that characterization in part because I don't want to take away from the actual first woman president, who we have not had yet, and I hope and expect we'll have in my lifetime. And she did act as chief executive. So it is fair to say, to the degree that anybody was acting as chief executive in 1919 and early 1920, it was Edith Wilson. And I get why that first woman president headline is what people want to use to capture the imagination. I just bristle at it a little bit because one day we will actually elect a woman.
I'm curious, what did you learn about her in the writing process?
I learned a lot about her, although she made it hard on me. She makes it hard on everybody because of this desire to curate her own story and blow this kind of hyper-feminine, wifely duty mist in front of you. It's hard to dig down and find out who she really was. But throughout her life, she kind of barreled her way into situations where she didn't really know what she was doing, but counted on her own smarts and confidence to get her through. And she got herself out of Wytheville, Virginia, this little southwestern town in Appalachia where she grew up and no one really expected anything of her. She became the first woman licensed driver in Washington and tooled around town in her little electric car. She inherited her husband's jewelry store, Galt's, which here in town was sort of the Tiffany's of Washington and the place that fancy people went for their wedding rings and christening. And she owned a business in 1908, which was just not something a lot of women did. And so there she was, kind of reinventing herself and trusting her own instincts despite her lack of a college degree, despite her lack of role models of doing what she was doing. And so if anybody was surprised that she stepped in 1919, they weren't paying attention. It was entirely in her character to have confidence in her own abilities, regardless of what sort of training and preparation she had.
I love it. She almost sounds like a Real Housewife. I've not actually watched Real Housewives, so I couldn't say with 100% certainty, but I think she would do really well on social media if she was alive today.
No question. I mean, I think that whole practice of curating your own image, right? I mean,
Yes.
Think what Edith Wilson's Instagram would look like. It would bear very little resemblance to reality, but boy, would we all be jealous.
Just the bling from the jewelry store.
Right. Yes. And the hats.
Yeah.
Really good hats.
Kevin, you wrote a fascinating and very honest article about President Wilson's connection to the cathedral in our spring-summer 2024 edition of Cathedral Age. So President Wilson is the only president to be buried not only in the cathedral, but in all of D.C. What led him to choose this?
So I'm going to steal liberally here from Rebecca's scholarship. So President Wilson was the son of basically an itinerant preacher throughout the South. They followed their family around Georgia and North Carolina and South Carolina and Virginia. So he never really had a home per se. And when it came time for them to leave the White House in 1921, they didn't really know where to go. And so they ended up buying a house down in Calorama, about 2 or 3 miles from the cathedral, and that's where they lived after the White House. When he died in 1924, there was no natural place for him to go. And I should say, I learned all of this by reading Rebecca's book. But
what's mine is yours, Kevin.
Thank you. But Edith Wilson, his widow, was in a little bit of a pickle because she didn't know where he should be buried because he didn't have any real connections to Virginia. He had been the president of Princeton University and had not left on the best of terms, so he didn't want to go there. He himself had said that he didn't want to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery, despite an offer to have him there. So there was this question of where do we bury him? And the bishop at the time of the cathedral was a bit of an entrepreneur and approached Mrs. Wilson and said, we're building this cathedral up the hill and it's going to be sort of America's answer to Westminster Abbey. And we're going to bury lots of famous Americans. And wouldn't it be great if your husband was one of the first? And she was an Episcopalian and thought about it and said, yeah, actually, that makes a whole lot of sense. So when he was buried here in 1924, the building wasn't much to speak of. It was still very much under construction. And he was buried in the crypt because that's all that was done. That's all that had been completed. And in 1956, on what would have been his essentially 100th birthday, he was moved up into the much more prominent spot in the nave of the cathedral, which had sort of been the idea all along that he would have this final resting place. The interesting story, I think, is that his grandson, his oldest grandson, was born in the White House while he was president. His name was Francis Sayre Jr. Francis Sayre Jr. grew up to become the dean of the cathedral, our longest serving dean from the 50s to the 70s. And so he had something to do with his grandfather's prominent placement in the cathedral.
There's also this great coincidence of timing that Edith died on December 28th, not till 1961, but December 28th was Wilson's birthday. And so when his grave in the nave here is marked on his birthday, as all presidential graves are, there's also a second wreath for her, mainly because it's her death day. But people who don't know that coincidence just sort of think that she got a little presidential recognition as well at the same time, and which is appropriate. And her wreath is often orchids. She was deeply into orchids. In fact, it was one of the first things Wilson loved about her. He said, "You are the only woman I know who can wear an orchid. On everyone else, the orchid wears the woman." So the orchids were a big deal.
And we should also mention that she is also buried here at the cathedral in the crypt.
Excellent. So the history of the Wilsons is not this glory story that we love to tell. There's a lot of complexity to it. Can you unpack some of the complexity for us between both President Wilson and Edith Wilson?
Be curious to hear Kevin on this, too, because he's been quite eloquent about Wilson's legacy, especially within the context of the cathedral. I can speak to Edith. Edith was very much a child of the Confederacy. She was born in 1872 in Reconstruction-era Virginia to a family that had been enslavers, plantation owners in the James River Valley. After the Civil War, they lost all of their money, as a lot of people who were sustained by slavery did. And so they moved to this little rabbit warren of rooms in Wytheville, Virginia. And so she was very much raised with this story that this was not what she should have been entitled to, that she should have been this plantation princess. And these lost cause myths were very, very much part of who she was. And even in her memoir, which she wrote in 1938, it's full of not just anachronistic language, but very bigoted attitudes about, the slaves in my family were happy and they didn't know what to do with their freedom. So it was very much baked into who she was, this white supremacy, basically, but also her own personal view that her family's status had come down in the world because of those Yankees. And so there was this regional and racial attitude that absolutely pervaded who she was. The most obvious things Wilson has been reevaluated for in terms of his own racism, most notably resegregating the civil service in his administration and screening Birth of a Nation in the White House, happened before they met. So she wasn't part of sort of those big examples people hold up of his racism, but it's very clear that they shared this sort of post-Civil War Southern attitude. Wilson, in part, was elected in 1912 because he was kind of a unicorn geographically. He had grown up in the South, but had been president of Princeton, so he had kind of, New England or at least East Coast elite bona fides as well. But he, by character and by self-definition, was very much a Civil War era Southerner himself. So I think that's sort of where that's I think what you're getting at in terms of the complexity that their attitudes were. I mean, there's no other word than racist. You have to use the word racist. And I don't think it's particularly fair to judge historical characters by the standards 100 years after their birth. But Wilson actually went backwards within his own time, right? He resegregated parts of the civil service that had seen some progress in terms of racial integration. And so I'm happy to judge both of them.
And I think, so the thing about President Wilson, or really all presidents, but particularly him, is that he is a deeply complicated person and who had some deeply complicated politics. And I should say at the outset, I'm not a Wilson defender or anything, but sort of an armchair historical nerd. But, he did do some good things. He led the United States through World War I and worked very hard to find the peace afterwards. Things that we take for granted now, the Internal Revenue Service, the Federal Reserve, the National Park Service, all sorts of things happened on his watch. So he's not somebody who did nothing good. He did actually quite a few things good. But as Rebecca said, he was also deeply racist and, was known for telling off-color Black jokes. And historians have argued about the politics of why he did and what he did and, all the different reasons. But at the end of the day, the fact remains that African Americans in this country were pushed backwards. That civil rights progress was pushed backwards. This was the height of Jim Crow and lynchings and barely a peep from the White House on any of it. So he was also, we should note, a man of deep, deep personal faith. I mean, he was a very pious, some would say almost too pious, I think, just kind of holier than thou figure. And so here at the Cathedral, our question has been, well, what do we do with him?
Right. And just thinking about the layout of the Cathedral, and Wilson Bay is right next to the Now and Forever windows.
Yeah, they're right next to each other, yeah. So historical figures, you kind of have two options, or maybe there's a third way, but you can, demonize them and say that they, need to be thrown out with the trash and canceled because there's nothing redeemable about them. Or you can lionize and canonize them and say that they were sort of these perfect Christian saints and gentlemen, and how dare we say anything bad. And I think neither one of those is a viable option. And as Rebecca told me, if you're trying to expect perfection from our leaders, you've got it all wrong. And so what we have tried to do, particularly most recently here at the Cathedral, is take just an honest look at him. And, as Anglicans, we very much believe in what they call the via media, or the middle way, where in a world that demands black and white answers to every question, that we sort of relish in the gray. And what we have learned about him is that we're all complicated. We're all sinners. We all have things that we wish we could have done better, but yet we're not all good. We're not all bad. We're probably a decent mix of both.
Mm-hmm.
And so our challenge, I think, here 100 years later after he died, is to just be honest about who he was and what he did and maybe what he didn't do. And, for me, to simply dismiss him or to simply say that, he did nothing wrong is too easy. It's lazy,
Yeah.
And it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't benefit anybody.
And that's the thing. It's not just bad history to reduce someone to sinner or saint.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually liberating to discover that our historical figures were flawed human beings, because we all are too. And if you can only change the world by being some once-in-a-generation perfect genius, then none of us can do it, right?
Right.
And I mean, maybe you, Joe, I don't consider myself a flawless saint.
No.
So I feel like the point of learning history, other than just it being interesting, is that it's got to turn the corner into being relevant.
Yeah.
And it is only relevant if you can see yourself in historical figures. And you can only do that if you understand that they are complex, three-dimensional humans with assets and flaws. And so it's A-okay to present these people as actual real humans. In fact, it's liberating in a lot of ways.
Mm. And I think that's what makes your book so compelling, is showing Edith Wilson with all of her gifts and strengths and flaws and how she tries to rewrite history to suit her own needs. But really, if you dig down, the truth is uncovered, and she is this very complex person.
Absolutely. And I think, women in particular of her era were so conditioned to downplay their own role. And she is no exception. I mean, she wrote a whole memoir that reduced her own role in history, which who does that,
Yeah.
But she did a lot of sort of pay no attention to the woman behind the curtain stuff because it was much more socially acceptable for her not to have made that impact. And I do think that is changing, thank goodness, but it does make telling her story a trick.
Well, in one of the early chapters, I think when you're telling her backstory growing up in Wytheville, you talk about the cult of womanhood. Is that the right term?
The cult of true womanhood.
Oh my gosh, that blew my mind. And I immediately went to the footnote thinking I need to read up on this, because how has this shaped what it means to be a woman in America for centuries?
Yeah, and you run up against it in so many different contexts. So just very quickly, it was sort of this pervading social norm, especially among white women, especially among East Coast women. Frontier women didn't have the luxury of this kind of nonsense, but it was this premise that women should be four things: domestic, pious, submissive, and pure. And it was trumpeted by all the ladies' magazines, and it was preached from every sermon mount, and it was, just absolutely ingrained in a certain generation and class of women that was the absolute ideal. And Edith was definitely not an exception to that. And by the turn of the century, it was kind of giving way to this new woman idea, where women were wanting to seek college educations, and they were fighting for the vote, and they were delaying marriage. And there was a whole movement that supplanted it. But Edith's world was very much the cult of true womanhood. And so she carried that with her, for sure, even after she became First Lady and acted as executive and owned a business and drove a car and did all of these sort of fierce, independent things. She kept cloaking it under the guise of this ideal that she had been taught.
So both President Wilson and First Lady Edith Wilson were people of faith. Growing up as a Presbyterian, we all learned early on President Wilson was a good Presbyterian minister, and Edith was a devout Episcopalian. Can you all talk a little bit about how their faith lives influenced how they acted in the world?
I think Episcopalianism was very important to Edith as part of that pious goal of the whole cult of true womanhood. She was not given to talking about her interior life, so it's impossible to know how much her faith shaped her actions. I will say that her Episcopalianism was something that she practiced her whole life long. And when she married the president, they would alternate Sundays going to his Presbyterian church and her Episcopalian church. So neither pressured each other to adhere to the other's faith. They kept their own faith throughout their long lives. And I think it was a huge part of the reason that Edith was comfortable burying her husband here at the cathedral, was because it was a faith she knew and adhered to and was proud of. And, you know, his Presbyterianism was no kidding around. Kevin and I were on a panel with a distinguished biographer of Wilson, John Milton Cooper, who calls him the most Presbyterian president ever. And I think that's a cultural as much as a faith description, especially if you buy into this sort of austere and superior and intellectual and unemotional characterization of Presbyterians, which maybe 100 years ago was more accurate. So it was very much part of who they both were and part of an individual part that separated them but united them in many ways.
And I think the thing about Wilson is it's worth noting that he, but also his grandson, Dean Sayer, really embodied sort of a soft Christian nationalism. Some might call it not so soft, but the idea of God and country, that America had this vital role in the world, but also this sort of vital spiritual role in the world. It's very different than, I think, the ugly Christian nationalism that we are seeing lately, but it is a sort of softer version that was out there. And Wilson certainly believed it. And if you read some of his remarks and speeches from World War I and why we had to get involved in the war and what peace meant, there's not much doubt there of how his sort of faith worldview was motivating his actions, in addition to his own personal piety. One of the things that I find most interesting about him, and his father was a Presbyterian minister who also owned slaves. And as I understand it, he was the last president to grow up in a house that had enslaved labor. But if you think about his religion and his views on race, were both shaped very, very early on by a minister who happened to be his father. So I think you can't extricate Wilson from his own personal religion and the ways that that played out in his presidency.
I think that's a really interesting point, especially because I want to emphasize that Wilson's faith was totally sincere.
Yeah.
You know, I think we have plenty of contemporary politicians who cloak themselves in the guise of Christianity and are very unchristlike. And Wilson, he might have made decisions that we don't agree with, but his moral compass was very clear to him, and it was very much rooted in his faith in God. And so he made all kinds of decisions that irritated his contemporary politicians about not using negative things against his opponents or not engaging in things that seemed sort of morally gray. It's how he developed that reputation for priggishness. But he was sincere in his faith. It was not something he wrapped himself in a cloak of in order to win votes.
Thank you. Is there anything else either of you wish to add to the conversation that hasn't been said yet?
The one question we get, and we've gotten it particularly a lot since, say, about 2020, is when are you going to dig up Woodrow Wilson? And he doesn't deserve to be in the cathedral. And our dean, Randy, has made it very clear that we are not in the business of desecrating graves or digging people up. Woodrow Wilson is going to stay at the cathedral. And I think the challenge, for us and for the cathedral is, okay, he's here. He's that sort of uncle that's, over in the corner at the family reunion. What are you going to do with him? How are you going to talk about him? How are you going to engage with him? So I think that's what's changed. And he's much more now than he used to be, just a spot on the tourist map, right? Oh, here's the only president buried in D.C. He's much more than that now. And I think the cathedral benefits when we really engage the questions rather than try to avoid them, but also just be honest who he is, why he's here, and what we plan to do next.
Thank you. With the complex history of President Wilson and his relation to the cathedral, where is the hope?
So I'm reluctant to call this a redemption story, right? Because it's not. But I think what is clear is that President Wilson and Mrs. Wilson, but particularly him, has a lot to still teach us. And in my view, all of the iconography in this cathedral, the statues and the windows, if they just become dusty relics, then what's the point, right? And the whole idea is that these figures from our shared history should still have something to tell us. And what Wilson says to me anyway is that we are all sinners.
Mm.
We all are desperately in need of grace. And there's only one figure in this cathedral, Jesus Christ himself, who might be judged by a different standard, right? But the rest of us, we're all broken and flawed and can always do better. And I think Wilson is a really visible example of what we can still learn from somebody like him. And, you know, it causes you to think, all right, well, if he could do it better, what could we do better? Or what would we go back and change if we had the chance? So, you know, even though he's been gone 100 years now, he still is very much still speaking to us, or at least I hope he is. And I think the question is, are we listening, and what are we taking away from that conversation?
Thank you. Rebecca, where do you find hope in the story of Edith Wilson?
Well, I have to say my answer is much less inspirational than Kevin's. It's sort of logistics. I mean, I feel that as a writer of women's stories, especially American women, that, you know, you're kind of stymied by three things, right? The fact that women themselves have hidden their stories, the fact that their sources are often hard to find or not digitized or not sorted or accessible, and just kind of garden variety sexism, right? That they weren't included in the narrative that has been told over time. And I see hope in all of those things changing. Certainly, women telling their own stories and the sources becoming easier to navigate, and I say this as a loyal employee of the Library of Congress, have been changing in real time as we have this conversation. Wow. That third piece, the women's stories deserve to be told, I think is also changing, not just because we are digging out some of these sources and revising the conventional wisdom of American history narratives, but also the people telling the story have become much more diverse and much more interesting. And so when you broaden the definition of who gets to have their hands on the pen of who tells your story, right? A whole musical Hamilton was written about it. Who tells your story? It's really important that the people telling the story of American history not just all be elite white men. And I see enormous hope in that. I think that I'm so impressed by the next generation of, I have kids in their 20s. They expect an entirely different world than I did. And they want equity. They want diversity. They want breadth of experience. They want to know about things outside their own bubble. And I find enormous hope in that.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Kevin and Rebecca, for your time this morning and sharing all of this fascinating information about President Wilson and First Lady Edith Wilson.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was fun.
I feel like this is a conversation that has only just begun for many of us. And as you said, Kevin, will need to keep happening as we keep engaging with this history and seeing how we go forward in the world. And as always, we want to thank you all for listening to Crossroads. And until next time, peace be with you. If the digital offerings of the Cathedral enrich your daily life, please consider becoming a supporter today by making a gift at cathedral.org/inspire.